So it's great to be here today. Rare and World Wildlife Fund have a long history together. Catherine Fuller, who may not even remember this, was once a Rare board member. And Carter Roberts, who won't let me forget this, was once a Rare board member. So it's nice to be here with you and with World Wildlife Fund today. I want to start with a story. And the story goes like this. Once upon a time, if this works, once upon a time in the island of St. Lucia, how many of you have been to St. Lucia? Raise your hand. Okay, so once upon a time, in about 1977 to be exact, there was this beautiful creature, the St. Lucian Parrot, and it perched dangerously close to the brink of extinction. In fact, this is what the data looked like when actually it was World Wildlife Fund, 1977, 1978, put out a report that said this species would not escape oblivion by the year 2000. So ask yourself, if you were a conservationist, and most of you are conservationists, what would you do to save the St. Lucian Parrot? And if you couldn't immediately think of something that you could do, who might you hire to do the job for you? Well, the government of St. Lucia hired this guy, the least likely of conservation heroes. Let me introduce my friend who's watching at home, probably in his undershorts in his bedroom on the computer, Paul Butler, ladies and gentlemen. Paul at the time was a recent graduate of London Polytechnic University, which he loves to describe as the only unprestigious university in the entire United Kingdom. And he is a proud alum. Paul decided that he could use some basic conservation strategies that he had read about and heard about, including creating a national park to protect the bird, passing basic wildlife legislation that would create fines or potentially incarcerate those caught with the parrot. The problem was passing any kind of legislation would require that anybody other than Paul, the few World Wildlife Fund researchers, and the Ministry of Forestry even knew that this bird existed. So in order to make any kind of change, first you have to build awareness. So Paul set out, a young, recent grad, to market the hell out of one St. Lucian parrot. Now, Paul was a young guy, and he had no money and very little skill in marketing, but he was a quick study. So he started off by looking at how other products were sold, and he said, we're going to need a billboard. So they produced a hand-painted billboard that says something about taking pride in St. Lucia. St. Lucia's wildlife is a living part of this island's natural heritage, and so began a grassroots marketing campaign. He then created a popular character, Rocco the Parrot. And Rocco actually became quite famous over time in St. Lucia. This comic book was just its entry into mainstream media. He created this flimsy little sad mascot of a St. Lucian parrot and traipsed around throughout the countryside, visiting every single classroom in the entire country of St. Lucia. And this little mascot eventually got its own theme song. And I'm not going to sing the song because there's a bunch of my staff here who will not let me live it down. But the title is Amazona versicolor, which is the Latin name of the bird. Try making a popular song using the Latin name of a bird. And so Paul traveled around, and eventually Rocco got his own tour bus. So St. Lucia is an island that's 16 miles wide. As far as I recall, there's one traffic light, but Rocco got a tour bus. And so began the process of building popular support for the protection of this parrot. Eventually, a public referendum was held. The St. Lucian parrot was named the national bird, and it made its way all the way to the St. Lucian passport. The message of the campaign was ubiquitous, unending, and very simple. This bird is ours. This landscape is ours, and we must protect it. Paul's nonstop grassroots marketing campaign became known as a pride campaign because that's exactly what it instilled in every St. Lucian who came across these efforts. More importantly, this campaign worked. You'll recall there were less than 100 species in the wild in the late 1970s. Once considered a lost cause for an idealistic young conservationist, we now know the parrot population, as of a report that's to come out in probably February, this is what's happened. it's fair to say that pride helped save a national symbol of an island in the Lesser Antilles. It's likely this bird would be extinct without the efforts of Paul Butler and the Ministry of Forestry. But think about this from the standpoint of behavior change. I have trouble getting my kids to do their homework. I have trouble getting out of bed in the morning to do some exercise before I go to work. I have trouble deciding not to eat those brownies in the back room there. This guy mobilized an entire nation and helped it rethink its identity in a way and helped it save a national symbol. It's quite a victory when you think about it. For his efforts, Paul received the Medal of Honor, citizenship in his newly adopted homeland, and then, for better or for worse for him, Rare hired him to join Rare and begin to propagate pride campaigns throughout the Caribbean. Here's what's happened. In addition to the accolades for those early efforts, with Rare, we've replicated over 200 times in 57 countries these pride campaigns, with a wide array of results, with a wide cast of characters at the helm of these campaigns. And the pace is accelerating. This year, we're going to launch 48 new campaigns and 48 new sites, fully a quarter of all those launched in more than 20 years. Basically, the plan is to clone Paul Butler and those who have followed. So here's the Spanish version, Mexican version of Paul Butler. That's Salvador Garcia. He reduced, using a pride campaign, working for a local NGO called IMECBIO, that was actually funded for years by World Wildlife Fund, 78% reduction in forest fires, simply by changing the way local farmers use their prescribed burns. Across the globe, Lani Warren, who was working at the time for Conservation International, convinced local sea gypsies to stop using cyanide and dynamite to preserve their reefs, and in the process built a constituency that enabled the launch of the 1 million acre National Marine Park in Togian Islands. In China, more recently, this is just last year, Lang Zhimin, working with Wildlife Conservation Society, reduced consumption of wild game by removing snares, getting local community members to remove all the snares from the forest to protect the habitat of Siberian tigers. Now, the cynics in the room will say clearly, seriously? Mascots, puppets? We're talking about tigers and fires and cyanide poisoning. But our response is, yeah, seriously. Behind this mascot, behind the puppetry, there is a method to the madness. And I want to just walk you through this briefly because, after all, this is about the science of behavior change, or the science of communications. The best way to read Rare's theory of change is just to start at the right here. So if you want a conservation result, let's say you want to increase the population of parrots, you're going to have to reduce the threats to parrots. And those have become common proxy measures for success in conservation. But if you're going to reduce a threat, any threat in conservation, chances are you're going to have to deal with people. You're going to have to change the behavior of local people. Now, here's where it gets really fun and really challenging. We came up with this terrific name for what is arguably the most important step in behavior change. If you're going to change human behavior, you've got to remove all the barriers to the adoption of the new behaviors. We're very creative at Rare, so we call this barrier removal. Barrier removal is really complicated. If you think of all the barriers to any change you're trying to make, they're social, they're political, they're economic, they're technological, they're cultural. What's really funny is when we hire new staff and they inevitably, first couple of discussions, they say burial removal, which brings on a whole host of other, I just can't help but enjoy those moments. But the rest of the theory of change, after you get past barrier removal, is really, in many ways, the easy part. But it's the part that most conservationists think of when they think of social marketing. It's how do you boost knowledge? How do you shift attitudes? And how do you increase the level of positive conversation about the change that you want to make on the street? Boosting knowledge and shifting attitudes requires that you get people's attention. And so that's why people tend to associate a pride campaign with the mascots and the puppets, the billboards, the bumper stickers, the radio PSAs, the contests, the art projects, the parades. That's all just attention getting so that the conversation can actually begin, so that change can begin. You've got to get people's attention. Then you've got to give them compelling reasons to change. And then we've got to be able to measure the actual change to see whether or not it actually works. There's a lot to be learned in this field in the coming years. But this is also the Achilles heel, I would argue, of conservation. The fallacy that if we just make people aware, something will change. I saw guys standing outside the atrium here just now, handling their Marlboro cigarette packages, smoking cigarettes, which say on the box, it will kill you. So you think about the fact that we continue to smoke despite the fact that it says, every day we look at the box, it says it's going to kill us. Human behavior change is not easy. But we also can't assume that knowledge is going to make a difference. We've got to move all the way through that process to change behavior. The science of human behavior change is the least understood, the least utilized, and the most important science in conservation. Because conservation is all about people. But fortunately, people can change. In our recent graduation of 26 campaign managers, and we've really only begun measuring actual behavior change, we saw a 28 percentage point increase on average in adoption of the targeted prescribed behaviors in the communities with which we were working, which is good news for conservation. We can train local conservation leaders, and they can unleash processes that lead to human behavior change. But obviously, this is a drop in the bucket. We're extremely proud of the results that we've achieved to date in hundreds of sites around the world. But over the last couple of years, we've begun to ask ourselves, and I heard John Foley this morning talk about not a silver bullet, but a whole lot of silver buckshot. So there's your silver buckshot, John. The question is, to what end? What do all these little glimmers of hope add up to? And so we've been wondering, a couple of years now, what would happen if we identified a chronic global conservation challenge over which local people have a disproportionate influence? And what if we could unleash a virtuous virus of behavior change to really make a dent in the universe? That'd be exciting. That'd be something to get out of bed and, exercise or not, come to work for. And so we've started to look around for, and I've heard several people on other panels talk about some of these bright spots in conservation, where with fuel-efficient wood stoves, you can reduce greenhouse gases, decrease pulmonary disease, make life a little better for a host of people. But there hasn't been widespread adoption of what is, and there's 100 good, efficient models out there. How do we boost adoption of a bright spot like a fuel-efficient wood stove? Or reciprocal agreements, which we're working on in the Andes right now, where communities upstream are incentivized by communities downstream for preserving water flows so that everybody can live sustainably off of a hillside. Sustainable agriculture is something new for Rare, but we're just beginning to explore in China right now ways that small communities can improve their yields and at the same time their preservation of soil or of water. But what's piqued our interest greatly in the last 2 years is this notion of fish banks. Some people call them turf reserves. Some people call them locally managed marine areas. Some people call them fish banks. We've decided to call them chocolate cake because everybody loves chocolate cake, right? I want to tell you about fish banks. I want to tell you why we're working on fish banks. First of all, these look a lot like that St. Lucian, the dire predictions of the St. Lucian Parrot. And we know that the seas are in trouble. The high seas fisheries, the mechanized industrial fleets are in many ways decimating fisheries globally. But even these near-shore fisheries, which happen to be arguably the most productive, the most biologically rich, and the fisheries that most people depend on day in and day out for their protein, up to 1 billion people globally, depending on fish for protein, these are highly unassessed, but endangered fisheries. And so what's really interesting to think about is this idea of a fish bank. 60 countries around the world have decentralized natural resource management. So a local mayor, let's take the Philippines. A local mayor in the Philippines can set up a marine protected area or provide territorial use rights to local fishermen. Step 2, you kick out anybody who's not from your municipality or hasn't signed on to protect Step 3, which is a no-take zone. What's great about this is there's 100 peer-reviewed journal articles that attest to the fact that inside a no-take zone, fish get big and fat and happy. It's the one time in life when getting old and big and fat is actually a great thing. And these fish produce a lot of offspring. And the offspring spill over into the surrounding fishery where local people have a vested interest, in fact, a guaranteed access right. And so it's that exchange, that quid pro quo, that enables a more sustainable fishery. Now, there's more than a handful of cases around the world where this has worked. And clearly, it looks really simple on paper. This is a big challenge. Ask any fisheries biologist who's tried to put one of these together. And it's going to require a great deal of human behavior change on the part of the fishermen, surrounding communities, neighboring communities, local mayors. But in these remote areas of the developing tropics, having a great incentive like this for local fishermen to do the right thing is manna from heaven to those of us who have been struggling to use pride to make behavior change work. So we're really excited about this opportunity. There's your spillover effect. The question becomes, can we do this enough to really make an impact? The impact, the potential benefits of spreading this virtuous virus throughout the tropics are numerous. Greater climate resilience for local communities, greater food security, better ability to govern natural resources collectively, openly, better fish production, a number of potentially really exciting opportunities. But first, we have to figure out how to replicate them. And so what RARE has begun to do in the last 18 months is train local conservation leaders to launch pride campaigns, behavior change strategies in 31 different sites, Philippines, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, then recently this year in Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, to put in place fish banks, turf reserves, that are fully supported not just by the fishermen, but by entire communities. And we'll see how this goes, but we're already extremely encouraged. 2 weeks ago, I was in the Philippines, and this was the launch of one of the first pride campaigns in the Philippines designed to set up a marine protected area with a no-take zone that would create all those benefits I just mentioned. There's 2,500 people just at this launch event. The local mayors stand up in front of everyone and they pledge their support for the MPA to preserve the no-take zone, to enforce it, and to invest to the best of their ability in this process. Then there's a flotilla, an actual parade. The first time, by the way, I've ever seen floats in a parade that actually float. And they travel out on the water and demarcate for everyone the no-take zone, the marine protected area, so people can see clearly there is a limit and that the whole community understands where that is. And much like in St. Lucia, every community, there's a dozen new communities in the Philippines, they have their own mascot, they have their own message, they have their own pledge, their own management committee, their own way of going about the process of fishing more sustainably. And each of them has their own call to action. In this case, this is one of my favorites, Malloy, the Panther Grouper, is teaching everybody how to text the hotline if you even think about fishing in that no-take zone. So go get him, Malloy. We'll have to get him the Taser app next. This is my favorite. This is Mabby, the new love of my life, because I think the orange clownfish, Mabby, is really the key to scaling this approach in the Philippines. Mayor Lim from Tagbilaran City in Cebu, where this mascot will be dancing around for years to come, is so taken with this idea that he, together with the president of the League of Municipalities, is already talking about how this would work in the 800 coastal communities throughout the Philippines. Now, mind you, we're a small organization. We have a host of small partners. We are only in 12 of these municipalities right now, but we only started 12 months ago, and a mayor and the president of the League of Municipalities is already talking about what this could look like all over the country. So we're extremely encouraged. In the end, conservation is about people. There are 100 million Filipinos. 100 million people who depend, more or less, on fish for protein. That's 100 million reasons to give this a try. But that's just one country. Overfishing is a problem of enormous scale all over the world. But we can't allow the scale of the problem to deter or delay our action. The problem may be global, but the victories, especially for nearshore fisheries, will be local. Right now, even as we talk, there are thousands of local conservation leaders around the world who are fighting to change behavior so that we can live more sustainably. They're working in villages that you and I will probably never see. Some of them are running pride campaigns in languages that you and I will never speak. But they believe as strongly as you and I do that this is the era of sustainable human behavior. And we, the conservationists, have to be the agents of change. Thank you.